Thank you for joining us today for our Pandemic Influenza Critical Concepts and Crisis Behavior and Communications webinar. Today I will be your moderator. My name is Michael Scott, and let's begin. So for our agenda today, our speaker, Steve Crimando, is going to be going through 5 sections, one on pandemic primer, current risk environment, planning assumptions, critical behavior considerations, and key communication concepts. Following that, I will present some best practices to consider for critical communication during these events, and then we will proceed to our Q&A. So before I introduce our speakers, I wanted to just give a high-level overview of why we're actually here today. So a lot of you know pandemic influenza can spread through your community quickly if an outbreak were to happen. On the CDC website, they estimate the next pan flu could cause between 80,000 and 7,000 deaths, with millions more being affected by it. In terms of the U.S. economy, it could impact it by the billions. And as with with any epidemic, or rather pandemic, whether it's influenza or another outbreak, it's important to consider some of these key best practices and recommendations that our speakers today are going to make. So with that being said, let me introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Stephen M. Crimando. He is an internationally known consultant and educator specialized in the application of behavioral sciences in homeland and private security, violence prevention, crisis management, and disaster response. He is the principal of behavior science applications and innovative and operational risk management consulting firm based in the New York metro area, serving a global client base. Steve is a diplomat of the National Center for Crisis Management and holds Level 5 certification in Homeland Security. Steve served as a disaster field operations supervisor for FEMA's mental health response to 9/11 World Trade Center attacks and coordinated on-site psychological operations at New Jersey's Anthrax Screening Center. He serves as a consultant and trainer for the Department of U.S. Homeland Security, U.S. Department of Justice, U.S. Health and Human Services, New York Police Department, Counterterrorism Division, and the United Nations Emergency Preparedness and Support Team. He has developed public health and emergency plans, procedures, and exercises for the response to pandemic influenza, Ebola, Zika, and anthrax for organizations of all types and sizes. Steve is an author of many published articles and book chapters. He has been featured for his work in many professional journals, magazines, and newspapers, and frequently appears on both network and cable news and talk shows, as well as in the courts, and a subject matter expert addressing the behavioral aspects of public and private sector crisis prevention and response. Following Steve will be myself, Michael Scott, Senior Program Manager for Everbridge. With that being said, Steve, I'm going to hand it over to you. You may begin. Steve, I'm not sure if you're talking, but you might be on mute.
And yes, I was. Thank you. Sorry about that, everybody. So anyway, thanks, Mike, and thanks, everyone, for joining us. When we talk about pandemic, really a few things to think about quickly is most organizations tend to be reactive. It's not until we have the news flash that another pandemic is being considered or potentially announced by the World Health Organization or the CDC that we start to really kick it in gear. But when you consider the fact that there'll always be another pandemic, we just don't know where, when, and how big or bad it'll be, it really is important that we almost always keep pandemic on our radar, pandemic influenzas, and the kind of specter of it was raised this year by a few different things going on. And one that I highlight here very quickly was Bill Gates speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland back in February, and his comment that he thinks, kind of one of the things that keeps him up at night really is the possibility of another large-scale disease outbreak, the thing that he quotes as causing 10,000 or more deaths. And of course, he's looking at this now from his position in the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and their epidemic preparedness work. But as planners and as crisis managers, really we need to think about the fact that there's always a potential pandemic kind of lurking out there. There always will be another pandemic. The thing that's really tricky from a planning standpoint is pandemics are predictably unpredictable. As I said, there'll always be another novel flu that can ramp up and be declared a pandemic by the authorities, meaning the World Health Organization and the CDC, but certainly not all influenza outbreaks rise to that level. The other thing to think about is this does require very, very specific sort of planning, and we can adapt some of our other crisis plans or emergency plans to pandemic, because pandemics are also very long emergencies. So what I'd like to do is kind of start the program with a very quick overview, as Mike said in the introduction, kind of a pandemic primer, just so we level the playing field. I recognize that on this call, there are a lot of people with vast experience in pandemic planning, and there's probably people who are absolutely brand new to it. So we're going to try to find the middle ground where there's something useful to everyone. And I think you'll see as we move through the curriculum that we're going to go into some pretty different sorts of aspects of pandemic that aren't typically explored, and ones that I think are very important and also very actionable for you. We have had pandemics over the last decade. We are, as I said, always in a place where we need to be in a position of readiness. And we also know that we're not hopeless. There's a lot that, when it gets discussed about pandemics can leave this sense of hopelessness. The fact, for example, that we really can't start creating a vaccine for a pandemic strain of influenza until we actually have the influenza, and several months elapse as we ramp up in production. But good planning and exercising around this scenario can really pay big dividends in having us stay one step ahead of this risk. So I am not going to speak in hopefully a fearful or kind of hysterical way about the risk of pandemic, but I will tell you this. You and I at this moment are in a very, very unique time and place in history in terms of how a pandemic would affect our organizations and affect our communities, and that's the way I'd like to steer the conversation during this presentation, to take those things that are different, that were not present in the last pandemic of H1N1 back in 2009, and were not present certainly in any pandemics before that. So having said that, we're going to move through the curriculum pretty quickly, and it is in those last three sections especially, and the last one or two in particular, that I think I've got some very useful and new content for you. So as I said, our focus will not be on building fear. It will be on building really preparedness and empowerment around this unique risk. And as I said as well, this is not a pandemic or Pan Flu 101 level program. We're going to assume that you come into this with a pretty good working knowledge of the generalities of pandemic influenza. But we will, as I said, as a way of leveling the playing field, start with the absolute need to know information. First of all, the term pandemic refers to the global spread of a disease or outbreak. And for a virus, and that's what we're speaking about here, not something bacterial, but for a virus to be declared as a pandemic, it has to be a strain or a subtype of a virus in which we believe the population has either little or no existing immunity. That means everyone's potentially at risk. Now, flus come and go, right? We have flu season every year, and we actually have some of these strains each year that we're familiar with, and some get baked into the next vaccine, that we're going to be pushing this fall. But here again, the thing that's really the focal point is this is a novel virus. It is not a strain we have seen, or it's not a type we've seen any time during our lifetime, so none of us have an immunity. The other part very quickly is this has to be able to replicate in humans very effectively, and it has to be able to be efficiently transmitted from one person to another. There are lots of strains of flu that don't make it to those criteria, don't reach those criteria, and never become declared pandemics. Now, the thing that kind of creates a novel strain is a process referred to as reassortment. And that's where you always hear that this is an avian flu or this is a swine flu, is that when we are sharing with birds, with pigs, and with humans, this flu strain every time it gets kind of shuffled around through that triad, either us and birds, us, birds, and pigs, you end up with this possibility that especially pigs end up being reservoirs for this flu virus, and it starts to produce, through the process of reassortment, a brand new genetic strain. So it is in kicking around between people, birds, and pigs that we end up with new versions of this, and it's always rolling the dice. It could be a strain that's very mild. It could be a strain that's very, very severe. So when you look at the numbers, we can look at pandemics over decades and actually over centuries. They're tremendously variable. So if you take nothing away from this early block of instruction, it's the idea that pandemics, as I said, are predictably unpredictable. Now, obviously, these are different than our average seasonal flu. Many more people become infected. We have lower immunity, the potential for serious consequences in terms of how many people are sick and how many people would die radically changes when we start to enter the discussion of pandemic. And the other part of this is in seasonal flu, we usually have a vaccine ready because the strain was relatively foreseeable and we're prepared for that. The real kicker in pandemic influenza is we don't have a vaccine and can't have a vaccine until months into the disease outbreak, which leaves a lot of people at risk. And we also don't know that the antiviral medications we have in our stockpile will be effective against the new strain. So when something reaches that kind of criteria for pandemic, it's way outside the normal range of our seasonal flu, and it's something that by definition means we won't be prepared for. Now, there have been, as I said, probably something like 10 major pandemics over the last 300 years and about 5 just in the last century alone, the last of these being the H1N1 in 2009. But if you look at these going all the way back to what's referred to as the Great Flu or the Spanish flu in 1918, which we think killed somewhere between 20 to 40, possibly 20 to 50 million people worldwide, you'll notice that many of these are H1N1. And those aren't like a sequential order. The designation of H1N1 and the other types of flu have to do with specific constellations of the way the proteins, the molecules, and the DNA structure of these viruses unfolds. So we've had H1N1s, but the strain in 1918, well, man, we have no one left alive really from that time frame. So they would have lived and developed an immunity to it. We don't, should that strain emerge again. So as I said, when we look at this, pandemics are kind of always out there lurking, and we do have to kind of stay in the level of readiness, as I said, because once a pandemic is kicked off, really we have one in motion, the spread of it around the globe is absolutely inevitable, especially given air travel. And you remember this back to now 2 years ago with the spread of Ebola from West Africa, and how that was really facilitated from a populated part of Africa out to really all corners of the world via air travel. And just like Ebola, some countries will try to slow or stop the spread by restricting travel. And of course, you need to instantly start thinking about what will be the impact of that on business, what will be the impact on that on society at large. The other thing to think about is pandemics historically have moved in waves, sometimes 2 waves, sometimes 3 waves. The waves themselves typically last weeks, and the period between waves can potentially be months. So you have this sort of situation where it kicks off, and I'm going to talk about each wave a little bit more specifically in just a few moments. That kicks off, you have this acute illness for a while, it seems to taper off, it's back, it trickles down, it's back potentially again for a third time. The other thing to consider as we talk about waves is if you're a multinational organization or if you work in a multinational environment, different parts of the globe will encounter different parts of those waves at different intervals. So your U.S. operations or North America operations may be in a very different place than your European, Asian, or Latin American sorts of markets as well. And pandemics are always viewed kind of along this timeline of the phases. Now that's important because when you start to think about planning, you want to plan for these in a phase-specific manner. Now if you look at the timeline very quickly, the thing that really starts to kick it into the early phases is in the very early phases 1 through 3. It's primarily in animals. It's in birds, it's in pigs, or some combination of those, and there's very few human infections. When we start to move into the later phases, you see, yeah, it is not just in humans, but it's now really sustained in human-to-human transmission becomes the primary mechanism of spreading the disease. And then when we get into the full-blown pandemic, kind of levels 5 and 6, it is almost entirely a human-to-human and a widespread human-to-human infection. When you look at down the line, the post-peak, what that suggests is we're into those different waves, the second or third wave. And as I said, that's going to look a little bit different. And as we trickle away from it completely, we move back into seasonal sort of flus and away from the pandemic. But the pandemic really in the center part is our major crisis point. Now, this is a key feature, and many of you know this, of course, is it's not possible really to create a vaccine until you have the virus. And depending on really the complexity of the virus can be weeks to months, and that leaves everybody vulnerable. So when you start to think about the waves of pandemic, the largest numbers of those who may die from a pandemic are actually going to be in the first wave because we don't have vaccine ready, and in fact we may not be confident that our existing antiviral medications would be effective. Let me go back one slide, which is important to just notice the headline or the title on this line that kind of distinguishes pharmaceutical options versus non-pharmaceutical options. And the truth of the matter is, when you look at the developing world, the vast majority of the global population probably would not have pharmaceutical options at their disposal. So while in more developed countries there may be vaccine and other sorts of antiviral treatments and so forth, those are not necessarily going to be available everywhere in the world or available in sufficient numbers. So the primary models of intervention would be non-pharmaceutical things, very simple, like social distancing, keeping away from each other, closing businesses, closing schools, or preventing mass gatherings, and things like isolation, quarantine, and restricted travel, as I said. All of those have very substantial social and economic impacts, as you can imagine. Now, all of that depends, obviously, on the severity of the pandemic, from moderate to severe to, outright catastrophic sorts of events. Unfortunately, because we never know how big and bad a pandemic will be, you have to plan for all of those contingencies. You have to plan from a serious pandemic right up to a severe pandemic. Now, the last pandemic, as I said, was 2009, and the one we've got our eyes on right now is designated as H7N9, and this is primarily in Asia, primarily in China, and it's designated by the World Health Organization as having pandemic potential. When we look at how the CDC views this, they're saying that H7N1 is a highly pathogenic bird flu right now, which to date has caused about 1,580 human deaths. Now, if you look at my numbers here, those numbers were released on July 12th. They come out every 2 weeks. The next set of numbers comes out tomorrow. And we expect certainly that to be a little higher, because if you go down our slide here, you notice that the findings of this infection in birds has dropped pretty much to zero, but the infection rate in people continues to slowly climb. So we actually have a virus on the horizon right now, the H7N9, which is something different than we've seen. It's not an H1N1. We don't think we have the same sort of immunity to this. And if you look at it, it's referred to as the Asian lineage H7N9 virus, and seen by the public health community as having the greatest potential for causing a pandemic. So we actually have something out on the horizon. So if you haven't really touched your pan-flu plans in a while, folks, it's time to dust them off. Even if this does not reach those levels or become designated as a pandemic, it's a good reason to kind of reinvigorate your existing plans or start creating new plans if you don't have anything in place. Now, some of our planning assumptions, without reading each of these bullets to you, really says you need to consider all of these categories, how it affects people's ability to go to work and stay at work, how it would affect travel, and travel for all reasons, business and otherwise, how it might tax our healthcare system, how it would overwhelm potentially or at least stress our government functions, what it would look like in terms of public support. Now, we're going to go there. We're going to go there very specifically in just a few moments, because that's going to be an important component of our discussion. And obviously how it starts to affect overall economic system, and that's really at a global level. So everything that we discuss pandemic related, you do have to think about as a global phenomenon, not just occurring in one region or one continent. So the economic disruption that we imagine and its impact on business really potentially stems out of significant numbers of absent workers. Those workers will be home sick. Those workers will be home caring for the sick. Those workers will be afraid to come to work or be around other people on their commutes or in their workplaces for fear of being exposed. So there's a number of things that kind of drive high levels of absenteeism, and all of those start to trickle down and having really, really significant financial disruptions to our marketplaces and to our financial system. So those are things we need to start considering whenever we talk pandemic. At any one organization, there's a number of foreseeable impacts on your operations. And as I said, the initial one would be reduction of workforce. And this is going to vary across the different waves. It's going to vary with severity of the pandemic. As I said, the first line that really starts to grab our attention is the inability or unwillingness to travel to work. And not only does this affect our workforce, this affects your whole supply chain and your customer base. You may have less people in need of your services or available to purchase your services. On the upstream side of the supply chain, you may not be able to get product or materials from your vendors to kind of continue your production or services of whatever line of work you're in. And also the diminished access to capital because the economic system is so impacted. And all of this starts raising really, really serious ethics, even business ethic concerns about how long we keep people on sick leave, about how we extend medical benefits if we're in a very, very long medical emergency. The other things we need to think about is, pandemics are primarily one of those risks that affects people, and it really doesn't affect infrastructure that much. I mean, your buildings and your technologies are pretty much untouched. It is people who are taken out of the equation. Now, a lot of COOP plans and a lot of business continuity plans are very heavily focused on, facilities and technologies and all the infrastructure, but that's really not going to be affected here. You really need to focus on the people piece of this, both in terms of the actual physical risk of illness, but also the behavioral response, and that's going to be very central to our discussion over the next several moments. Organizations then have to be pretty nimble because once something kicks off and becomes a pandemic, it can move pretty quickly around the world. And you need to be prepared to switch into some alternative modes of operating. And that may mean a lot more people working from home or alternate sites. It may mean that a lot more of your services or your work are done in virtual environments as web-based or teleservices. From a staffing standpoint, if your workforce is diminished, it may mean some increased flexibility in terms of things like job sharing or shifts. As we cover people who get sick, go through the process of being sick for a few weeks. And these flus are historically a little more serious than your seasonal flu, so it does take people kind of a good month to really start feeling better. From what we've learned, those people who do, recuperate well. So a greater reliance on your distance technologies for sure for almost all of your daily functions. And as I said, this really affects everything in our supply chain, from your workforce to materials to capital. As I said, really every part is affected. Now, because this is a people-centric crisis, right? It's about, the individual's health and their perception of this risk, communications become very, very critical. There's a lot your organization should be doing in planning. This, folks, is easy to find online. If you don't have, existing or robust pandemic plans, there's lots of good resources from the CDC, World Health Organization, and major, kind of crisis management groups that can give you templates and kind of the bones of a good pandemic plan. But I want to focus today on a few things that are sometimes not as well addressed in the plans that absolutely become critical to your ability to handle this kind of crisis. And that's kind of around behavior and communication. So let me start with behavior first. When we think about most emergencies, Most emergencies produce in our communities, and I don't just mean in your neighborhood, I mean your workplace as well, your teams and your programs and all your coworkers. They produce what we're going to refer to as a type 1 neighbor helps neighbor response. Now, if your neighbor's home is badly damaged or a coworker is sick, we all want to chip in and help out. We want to donate or bring something to help those folks because we feel for them, and they're, of course, our neighbors or our coworkers. But when we introduce fear into the situation, say, for example, the fear that me reaching out to you may get me exposed to disease, may bring that home to my loved ones, that fear starts to erode the cohesion in your organization, the cohesion in your workforce, and the cohesion in your community. And it starts to make a bad thing worse because now neighbors or coworkers have to fear each other. And that starts to undermine all the normal supports that we offer for each other. And in the worst case situation, fear can be so acute that it actually triggers what we'll refer to as a type 3 or neighbor competes with neighbor response. Now we're going to dig into that more fully in just a moment, but you can start to envision the kind of things that people would compete for. And this is where we start to see the potential for a panic. Now, panic is unlikely in most disaster and crisis situations, and panic is not simply just, kind of extreme or acute fear. It's that fear moving through groups. It's that fear that has a contagious aspect to it. So in addition to the contagion of the disease, you actually have the potential for contagious fear, which we're going to refer to as kind of mass sociogenic illness or the potential for epidemic hysteria. And this is not part of every disaster or emergency scenarios. It's really unique, but it is something we do have to anticipate in disease outbreaks. And these panic people, they're thinking survival. Really, all bets are off. I need to get out of here and get my loved ones out of here. I need to get the last medications or supplies. And it really is each person or family for themselves. And this is really based in economics. And the classic definition of economics is not just about money and the stock markets and so forth. Economics, by definition, is the allocation of scarce resources. And when we start thinking about disease outbreak, that's vaccine, and it's masks, and it's hand sanitizer, and Tylenol, and thermometers, and all the things people associate with the flu. And that scarcity has the potential to actually create black markets in which people are gobbling up everything they can, but we start to see bogus medications. We start to see contaminated medications. We start to see things being introduced into the supply chain that are not going to be helpful and actually may get people sicker and actually spread the disease. So panic is something, as I said, we don't see in all crisis or emergency scenarios, but is actually much more likely in disease outbreaks. And specifically, and this is interesting, I believe in actionable, we can actually start to map out where we're likely to see panic. If we're going to see panic in a pandemic, we're most likely to see it on the front side of the first wave. And if your question is like, why would it be isolated there? It would primarily be there because think about it. In the first wave, we don't have vaccine yet. We have the highest numbers of people being infected, or some of the highest numbers, because it's a novel virus. None of us have immunity. And more specifically, when we look at pandemic infections, the majority of people who would die in a pandemic, they're going to die in the first wave. Because what happens by the second wave is those people who are exposed now are immune, whether they got the flu badly or not. They're going to be immune. So they're going to be around to help out in different ways, and different things are going to continue. By the second wave, we're likely to have the vaccine, which means we're still going to be having, and you see the wave is higher, we may have more sick people, but you're going to have less people dying. Also on the first wave, which really is a kick to everybody, is because we have the most deaths, while we have fear and panic on the front side of that wave, you have grief and loss and bereavement on the back side of that first wave. Now those things start to change, as I said, as we move through. You have greater numbers of sick in the second wave. You have greater numbers of dead in the first wave. So as horrible as that is to think, and none of us know how big and bad that'll be or what those numbers will look like, the wave the factor that or the feature that there's these waves really changes our planning, especially around, what the emotional impact will be and the behavioral challenges as well. Now, most disasters, when you think about your planning, something like fire, flood, earthquake, active shooter, bombing events, those events have bookends. People clearly know when they start, when they stop, and they know if they're in or out. But with something that's invisible, whether it's purposeful, like a CBRN, chemical, biological, or radiological sort of hazard, or it's a disease outbreak, you're talking about bacteria and viruses in which people can't see it, smell it, hear it, taste it, and you're not really clear if you've been exposed. And you always have this kind of fear that you may be sick. So what that starts to do is drive this very, very unique set of behavioral reactions that doesn't look like the emotions or behaviors we see during and after other disasters. If you think of events that have bookends, we're more likely to get traumatic stress reactions. But when we look at invisible threats, we have a whole different constellation of both behavioral and medical responses that drive surge. And what I mean is driving surge in healthcare, which we have just vastly greater numbers of people, sometimes referred to as the worried well or the walking well, who show up seeking care. Because think about this: if there's a terrible flu outbreak, and you're seeing this on the news, and this is the story. If you have a sniffle, if you have a cough, if you have a scratchy throat, your natural inclination is to think, oh my gosh, can I possibly be sick? And it drives us down to get tested. It drives us down to get perhaps medication or anything else we think that can help. So what we have in invisible threats are much higher rates of what we refer to as multiple and sometimes known as medically unexplained physical symptoms. In the military medicine, are referred to as multiple idiopathic physical symptoms. They mean the same thing. They mean the person has the signs and symptoms of the illness. They're not imagining this. They really have signs and symptoms. But upon examination, there's no underlying illness or injury. It's stress-induced. If you think about something like hives, the person who has hives, you could see them, they could see them, but we know that stress initiates or induces them, and stress can exacerbate those. But they're not necessarily sick, although they have the symptoms. Obviously, that drives people to believe they're sick and go look for, emergency health care. Part of that is another dynamic called misattribution of arousal, which means when people are afraid, it elevates their stress response, and they start to feel that heart rate, blood pressure, stomach upset, things like that. And that also drives them to, go get medicine or go get checked out. And all of these are foreseeable. So there's a whole bunch of tricks that our mind and bodies actually play on us when we believe we've been exposed to, something like this invisible health risk, and all that can feed, kind of a panic and this surge in healthcare seeking behaviors. Now, one that's baked in there, kind of in the middle of my list, is what we call mass sociogenic illness. And as I mentioned earlier, sometimes that's referred to as epidemic hysteria. And that is when you have a contagion through our workforce or contagion to our community in which that fear starts to spread. But not only just the fear, these kind of emotionally driven or psychologically driven symptoms. So I want to spend a moment on how people think about this risk and what we can do about that. One of the main theories of this is referred to as the extended parallel process model. And if you look at this flow chart with me, kind of left from right, what we know is cognitively and very subconsciously, when people are given information about a new threat, they assess that very quickly in this sort of flow. First, they think about susceptibility. Does this have to do with me? Because if you say there's a new flu, but it only affects the very old, the very young, and the immune compromised, you may think, hey, that's not me, and we reject that message. I'm not going to pay attention. I'm not going to take action. But if you're convinced it does affect you or potentially could, your next question is severity. Is this something sufficiently big and bad that should get my attention? And again, if the answer is no, they're saying there might be kind of a bad flu season, but it's nothing serious, I may still not, respond to that. But if I meet those first challenges and I think, yeah, it has to do with me and it could be bad, my next question, the second level of appraisal, is do I know what to do? That's self-efficacy. And does my does my company, does my community, does the government know what to do with that? If the answer to either one of those questions is no, we end up with much higher levels of fear that almost become paralytic, that people don't take action. But if the answer is yes to those, I know what to do, and my company knows what to do, I accept the messages about what to do next, and I change my behavior accordingly. So where we want people in your organization, your community, is this upper right quadrant where they have a significant, they have the right level of fear, the right level of concern, but they also have a significant level of confidence that they know what to do. And you, whether you are the employer, the government, or whoever, that we know how to handle that. When we're in that place, we get the best result. How do we get people in that place? We start thinking about some key concepts in communication, and then we start to think about what we say and how we say it to people. We know the countermeasure to this sort of fear is empowerment. People don't want to be dependent on others to take care of them, and people don't want to feel powerless. And you know what? If you're watching the news and they're saying there's this terrible disease and there's nothing we could do to stop or slow the spread of it in this first wave, we don't have vaccine yet, and many people are being sickened and many people are dying, yeah, that feels powerless. So we're trying to bring about a level of mental readiness as well as organizational readiness that helps reduce anxiety, reduces uncertainty, and helps reduce the possibility of kind of irrational or counterproductive behavior. Now, we are, as I said, in a very different place right now, and we're going to go there more specifically in just a moment. But there is a lot of mental noise in any crisis. There's more mental noise during disease outbreaks, and there's a lot of mental noise out there in kind of our communications environment right now. And when people are confronted with this noise, it actually becomes very, very counterproductive, and it starts to compromise the ability for decision making. So a few things you need to remember in crafting your messages and thinking about how we communicate is that people judge the messenger before the message. So who is it? What is the credibility of the person in your organization or an external resource you're pointing them to? Who is this person or group who's sharing the message? Why should I believe them? And all of that is really communicated in both verbal and nonverbal levels. So we really have to come down hard on credibility, on being sincere, because the bottom line, if you think about this on this slide, in this level of stress, facts play almost no role when compared to perception. Now, this is an important message for me. I hope this makes sense. The more fearful the situation in your messaging, the more important it becomes to lead with empathy, which is to say first. This ought to be the first thing out of your mouth when you make a statement. We understand, we can appreciate just how frightening this situation is, but we want to catch you up on what it is known, what's being done, and what action steps you can take. So you always want to lead with that kind of statement. We can appreciate, we can imagine how frightened people are by this. Let people know right away you get the emotional part. Because if you take the temptation and go right to the technical or the medical discussion, and people don't have a sense that you get the emotional impact, they will not fully absorb and utilize your other facts that you share with people. The other thing to think about is you need to be on your toes. Speed counts, and you really need to have kind of phase-specific messaging in place, and this means perhaps developing those templates well ahead of time. And you go back and modify them and tweak them as the environment changes, but you have to be ready to go with your messaging. If you are behind the curve, other sources will fill in that vacuum very, very quickly. And once rumor and misinformation starts to spread, it is incredibly difficult to unscare people. So accuracy and timeliness become critical, and if you don't know, don't be afraid to say you don't know, but don't speculate because you actually may be fanning the flames of uncertainty. What is it we should share? You should share information about the general facts of the flu. You should get those from credible sources like your health department, like the CDC, like the World Health Organization. What should people know about the disease? What should they know about treatment? What should they know about prevention, like hand washing and cough etiquette, about social distancing, making sure we're promoting the idea that they're getting out there and getting their shots, all of those sorts of things. And this, a very important phrase in our thinking, action binds anxiety. That goes back to this concept of efficacy, empowering people by giving them things to do. Home and family preparedness, things to do in the workplace. When we start to lose grip on the behavioral or the emotional concepts or component of this, it's because we're not really speaking to people in a way that they can take action. Now, we know there's a number of pitfalls that are common in disease outbreaks, and that's when, and this is common in our cable television news anymore, you have dueling experts. You have a panel of experts who are talking about, this is very severe, and others who are minimizing it. This is the medication you should take. Oh, no, that's not the right medication. When there's disagreement among the experts, when information is released too late, it feeds rumors, it feeds myths, it builds uncertainty, and it becomes very hard for us then to have any authority or credibility. Now, this is where it's all different, guys, and this is where we're going to finish with these next two slides and move on to some information Michael wants to share and some information and your questions and comments as well. We are in a very different environment in terms of social media. Social media can play a critical role in sharing good information in the public health crisis, but it's a two-edged sword, because our same social media technologies, whether they're very simple technologies like our cell phones and our texting, down to our social media applications and platforms, they can also spread misinformation and rumor equally as quickly. That can be very, very difficult to take back. So social media during public health emergencies does not cause extreme psychological or psychophysiological reactions, but it can contribute to the rapid spread of fear through our communities. Think about your community as being your workplace as well as the neighborhood you live in. So this is critical and really an anchor to where I'm going and where I'm going to leave the conversation in just a moment. The public health response to the next pandemic, whether it's the one that's in Asia right now or somewhere years to come, it will look nothing like the last one in 2009 and nothing like the ones before that. And this is because of the ubiquity of social media platforms. It's because of the advent of these concepts of fake news and alternative facts. If we have to trust our authorities, our governmental authorities, with giving us good information in a timely way, and the public now has in their mind the idea that the news may be, not accurate, may be manipulated, may be fake news, this is going to undermine public confidence in a way that could be absolutely crippling to us. So we have the concept now that we've never had to deal with before, which is the possibility of hyperaccelerated epidemic hysteria, which means in plain language, the panic, the fear, and those medical reactions that I discussed that are triggered by panic and fear may be at levels we have never seen in any other sort of crisis, period. So I am not here today to hype the fear around the next flu. I am here to say that the importance of planning right now, communications especially, has never been more important. We are in uncharted waters in terms of the force multiplier effect that social media, fake news, and alternative facts can have on a pandemic. If you've ever had to get your pandemic plan in good shape, this is the time to do it, because on top of the risks of the disease, we have communication challenges that we have never seen before. So bringing it all together, as I said, you need to think about the phase-specific nature of the disease as well as your plan. You need to consider those rare reactions I mentioned in events that lack bookends. We need to talk about getting people going and getting your organization going around this idea of binding anxiety and following this flu, because you need to be ahead of this curve. You will not be in a place to react and survive. You must be able to be prepared and on your toes, or you will be substantially behind the curve. Michael, that's all I have for today. Please go ahead if you'd like to take control back and share with the group what you can, and then we'll take some questions.
Sure. Thank you, Steve. So just be 1 second, everyone, while I switch over. And I'm going to go quickly through my session, everyone. I know we're anticipating and excited for the Q&A, so we'll be moving to that very shortly. Okay. All right. So thank you everyone again for joining us, and thank you, Steve, for your portion. So as like I said before we get to Q&A, we're going to go over a couple best practices for pandemic and influenza preparedness and response in terms of critical communications. So during events like this, whether it's pandemic influenza, or we even had a customer who leveraged our system for something and related to a hepatitis outbreak. Anything of this nature, you need to be prepared for, and ultimately it comes down to there's many individual steps, but really the four major parts that we like to break it down to, which includes getting the best assessment, figuring out what's actually happening, what's wrong, figuring out, essentially compiling all the information. Because that moves to the next one. Time matters. People need to know. With events like this, the faster you can figure out what's wrong, the faster you can move on to the next step, which includes coordinating your response teams, people who are going to reach out to the public and inform the community, which is the fourth step, letting them know, hey, here's some measures you can take to avoid these illnesses or to better protect your families. Or if you are affected, what are some tips to get better, or where you should go in terms of healthcare. So let's move over to pandemic influenza outbreak and response. So ultimately, speed and accuracy are going to be crucial and critical to getting people, to keeping people safe and healthy. So with systems like Everbridge, you're allowed to automate the process in many ways by leveraging incident templates, which essentially let you build out a scenario from beginning to end prior to an event happening. So while you're hoping that you never have to deal with this incident, or even stepping out of the realm of an outbreak, something like an active shooter or terrorism, there are certain measures and plans that you already probably have in place, or that you're already leveraging, that you can incorporate with your system and build out the communication for that in advance. Additionally, it's important to have mapping information built out into your solution. So when this happens, if it's targeted to a certain area, such as years ago when in letters they were sending there was threats of anthrax, being able to via map draw out a polygon of affected areas and alerting those people, or compiling responders to go to a certain area. It's important to have the technology and the ability to do that, and also to reach people as many ways as possible. Even with the best systems and multiple systems, it's going to be hard to be able to reach everyone because people receive information different ways, and they also receive it different ways at different times of the day or time of the week. So it's important to be able to deliver information simultaneously through social media, text, email, voice, and even online bulletin boards. Additionally, in terms of internal communication, you're going to want to be able to quickly communicate with your responders and stakeholders and let them know when buildings are open and safe, if it's a public building, or when it's safe to inform the community to proceed to certain areas. It's also important to locate and communicate instructions with responders based off a different skill set, meaning who's actually on call, who's working right now, who has a certain skill set, permissions to work, or permissions to work on a certain type of event. You want that all integrated in your solutions, the schedules and things like that, so you can be able to get the right people at the right time to the right places. So give you guys a little quick overview of Everbridge. We're an enterprise software application really built to improve organizational response for critical events, such as an outbreak, to keep people safe and business organizations running. So just to give you guys a little context, Today we're focusing on pandemics and outbreaks, which are very critical events, but Everbridge is also leveraged from a wide variety of events, from more emergency events such as an active shooter or weather to for any of our private sector customers or viewers on today, to more operational issues like an IT outage or issue with supply chains or product recall. And like I had mentioned, we're used across a variety of verticals. So that includes financial services, the auto industry, consulting firms, U.S. cities, entire state departments, including Florida and Connecticut, and numerous health providers throughout North America. So I'm going to launch a quick poll. I know we want to get to Q&A, so I did go through that very quickly. So I apologize to anyone looking to get more information on Everbridge. But at this time, I just ask you to fill out a quick poll I just launched, so that way we can make sure anyone who is interested, we can follow up, at a time that best suits you guys. And I'll give that about 30 seconds, and then we'll get back to the webinar, and we'll get ready for Q&A. Also, while you're filling that out, I did include as a handout, if you go to the handout sections in your GoToWebinar panel, one of our data sheets on our incident communications for government solution, which will give you guys a little bit more information on how you can build out these plans with Everbridge and have these communication workflows set up in advance and integrated with your other systems such as your CAD and your HR and scheduling databases. Another 10 seconds and we'll get back to the webinar. Okay, so I want to thank everyone for filling that out. Like I said, anyone who said yes, we'll definitely have someone, a product specialist, reach out to you with more information so you guys can get answer any questions related to our product that won't be answered today on the Q&A. So with that being said, Steve, let's move on to the Q&A, and I will begin now. And for any of you who haven't asked questions yet, to do so, go to the GoToWebinar panel, select the drop-down, and type your question in the text box. Make sure you submit it to all panelists, though, so all of us can see it and respond to them. So let's go with our first question. Here we go. It's from Clement. Steve, and this is for you. He wants to know, how do you think this would be handled in South Africa with a bad medical preparation for such a pandemic?
I have no special knowledge about that region or the country, but I will tell you this. When we look at the continent, as we look at Africa and some other regions of the world, there's tremendous variability around the difference between urban and more rural areas. And when we think about just how infrastructure can be compromised, how the spread or the ability to travel and monitor people to get medications to them and so forth, there's great variability. So if you take any country, especially if you take some of our African countries, what it looks like in the cities and what it looks like in the, out in the country, the more rural areas, can look radically different. For the larger cities in South Africa, certainly the access to healthcare, access to medications, access to all the infrastructure to deliver that is going to be radically different. So I hate to give the wishy-washy answer of it all depends, but even in any one country, and certainly as develops, there's changes, we're talking about the developing world versus the developed world, it could be radically different based on where you are in the country and also people's history with these kind of diseases. There can be great cultural variation, and it can be just historic feelings that our government has overreacted or underreacted to these threats in the past that can radically alter how the population will respond. So, Michael, I hate to give the wishy-washy answer, but it's going to depend very much on where in any one country people are and those other kind of moving targets. And, you know, you're talking in any one country, multiple cultures, as well as multiple views on health, public health, and government intervention. So it's a real moving target that I'm sorry I can't give a more specific answer to.
Thank you, Steve. The next question for you, Steve, is are there any online resources, we see you work for numerous government agencies, that we can leverage in our community now to build out these plans?
Yeah, I would start with just simply at cdc.gov and look at the different resources that are online. The next level I would really promote you to look at is if you're here in the U.S. Or really any other, one of our other, sorts of nations that participate today, your local health departments very often do have access to state level or province level information that's going to be a little more targeted. But given our experience globally with pandemics, a lot of the government organizations over time have done good work in building toolkits. So if you do go online and simply do searches for pandemic planning toolkits, you'll see a variety of them that are available from leading government organizations such as the CDC, from state-level health departments, and some from private sector organizations and consultancies that essentially all contain the same thing. So we know the phases, we know the challenges, what we need to do for planning. It's very, very well established. That is not a moving target. The thing we don't know is when there'll be another pandemic and how big and bad it will be. So the resources for developing your plans are widely available. And if you have any trouble finding them, reach out to me directly, reach out to me through Michael, and we'll connect you with those resources. But you should not have any trouble finding those online.
Thank you, Steve. The next question is for me. It's regarding Everbridge's mission communication platform, or at least I'm assuming. So Joe in the audience wants to know, for everyone else listening, if Everbridge can leverage outside groups, meaning local health centers, to within the system, meaning put them into groups, I'm assuming. So the answer is yes. So you could, if you're working with those outside organizations and you're building out your plans, and you're going to be working with them, you can definitely include them into specific groups. It's also good if you're going to be running drills to make sure that all their information is working while you're running them and they're in the room, if you're going to do a tabletop for these. But yes, you can do that with the solution, even our base solution. So it's right at the top of the hour. Let's get to two more quick questions. The first one is, are these slides going to be available in the recording? So yes, I apologize for not mentioning that earlier. The slides in the recording will be available after the webinar. In a few weeks, Steve and I are working on the written version of this, so I'll also be sending that out to people who attended in a few weeks. And then the last question, Steve, do you recommend, Leslie in the audience wants to know, will we probably see H7N9 included as a strain for flu vaccines in the near future?
The near future, yes, but not for this flu season. The lead time on the production of flu vaccine is several months. So I think part of the risk factor right now about the current avian flu is that it is not going to be present, as far as I know, in this offering, this flu season's vaccine. So downstream, that variant will probably be part of the mix, but I don't know that it's going to be in time for this flu season. So we're concerned about, that's where the pandemic potential still lies in this current strain.
Okay. Thank you, Steve, and thank you for everyone who has joined us today. I apologize if we didn't get to some of your questions. However, we run these webinars quite frequently, at least once a month with Steve. So you'll have another opportunity at our next one. Again, if you're looking for the slides or the recording, they will be delivered to anyone who registered for the webinar. And they should be out tomorrow or the following day. So keep an eye out for that in your inbox. As always, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Steve, for a wonderful presentation. Have a great day.